Hey Tim, sorry for the delay in my response. The question you posted is actually an easy one, but it does require some theory to understand. So I went ahead and tried to work out a concise explanation that gives you just enough to grasp the concept. So hopefully this one will help. So there are a few things we will need to assume. First thing is, I will tend to use the word pitch and note interchangeably since they have such a close relationship to each other. For a lay purpose, that should be fine. And also, because your question concerns the D6 chord and the Bm7 chord, you'll need to know the D major scale as well as the B minor scale to understand my answer. Do you see those letters with hyphens in between? Those are the notes to the scale in proper ascending order from the lowest to highest pitch. This is from left to right. Similar to how the lower notes on a piano are to the left side and the higher notes are to the right. Also, there's whole theories about what makes a scale major or minor, but that's a lesson in of itself, so we're gonna bypass that. Just for the time being, just assume the scale notes I listed to be true. We will be referring back to these scales throughout as well, so you may want to take a moment and write them down. Finally, I alluded to how going from left to right is an ascending progression, so when I say something like go up the scale, that means we are moving towards the right, visually speaking. If I say go down the scale, that is going towards the left. Again, we're thinking in terms of piano. So some chord basics. The first thing we need to understand is what is a chord. Up to this point, you have been playing various chords on your Bari ukulele as if they were intrinsic entities and hand shapes. But to answer your question, it is important to see chords differently and more precisely. Chords are simply notes being sounded at the same time. Following the strictest definition, you can have 2-note chords where you play 2 notes at the same time, 3-note chords where you play 3 at the same time, 6 notes, and so on. But never will you have a 1-note chord. For our purposes, you can see chords as a kind of opposite to a melody being a stream of individual notes being sounded one at a time in a sequence. In our Western music approach, there are certain standards applied to chords, though. Oftentimes, we think of chords in 3 main notes, the root, the third, and the fifth. So let me just define things generally before I go into specifics. The root, also known as tonic, is the foundational note of the chord. It establishes the identity and the family of a chord. So in an E minor chord, for example, it is the E that is the root. Or in a C6 chord, it is the C. The fifth is another note that often complements the root and can add a fuller sound to it. You don't always need it though, but again, it's useful when you want to create a more fuller sounding chord. The third is the variable component. If the root determines the identity, it is the third that defines the character of a chord. Just to keep things simple, the third is what determines if a chord is major or minor. So just to recap, one way I like to see the relationship between these 3 is as a family. Roots are like parents. We get the family name from them. They are there from the beginning and generally seen as the most stable part of the family unit. The fifth are like grandparents. Not every family needs to have them living with them to be a family, but when they do, they add even more fullness and warmth. The third is like children. Just as children are impressionable and malleable, they go through phases, like superhero phases, goth emo phases, terrible twos, all of that stuff. And all of these different phases, as it does with parents, they influence the response of the parents and grandparents, which in turn can drastically change the character and mood of the family unit at the time. So and likewise, depending on how that third is, it changes the chord into, say, a major or a minor chord. So how does this play out in forming a chord? When we say a chord, we are actually assuming a scale and picking out certain notes from the scale to play together. For example, let's take a C major chord. Because it is a C chord, I will start the scale at C. Secondly, because we establish it as a major chord, the scale notes following the note C will be in the spacing of a major chord. Again, we won't go into the theory of scales, so I just listed out the pitches for you on the presentation. So let's go ahead and take that scale. Let's form the C major chord using the standard 3 notes. Remember that everything begins from the left going to the right, so let's go find the root. And that would be the first note of the scale. So that is the C on the left side. We then need the third. So again, starting from the left, the third note up, which is an E, and then finally the fifth is found going up to the fifth note, which is a G. So the notes for the chord are C, E, and G. That is basically how you do it. So let's dive into the chords you specifically asked about. Let's take your D6 chord. For now, we will put aside the 6 and focus on the D. Because there is no minor attached to the D, we can assume that the chord implied is a major one. So the scale starts on D, and we'll have those listed notes since it is a major. Let's form our basic 3-note chord. So the root, where everything begins, that's D. The third is 3 notes up the scale, so that is F sharp. The fifth is 5 notes up the scale, so we get an A. Now just go ahead and put that info aside for later, and let's move on to the Bm7 chord. So we'll do similarly and put aside the 7 for now. Let's just focus on the B minor. Since it is a B chord, the scale will begin on B, and since we established that it is a minor chord, it will follow the minor scale pattern, which I listed for you on the presentation. Same process, let's make that chord. So the root is B, since that is where it starts. The third is D, since that is the third note of the scale. And the fifth is F sharp, since that is the fifth note up. So remember those numbers, the 6 and the 7? This is where this comes in. So basically, it's actually really simple. With those numbers, they just want you to expand the chord and add those notes to it. So just for example, sometimes on chords, you'll see a 7, sometimes you'll see a 6, a 9, 4, 2, and whatever else you may possibly want. So for example, if it asks for the 4th, you just go ahead and add the 4th note up the scale to the existing 3 chords that you already have. And it's the same with any other number. So just for fun, and just, well, actually more of a fun note for you, you can actually use this method to tell musicians to adjust the pitch to a note not usually found in the scale as well. So for instance, if you had a flat 9, the B is the musical symbol for flats. You take the 9th note of the scale and bring it down a half step in pitch. If you had a sharp 9, the pound symbol being the musical symbol for sharps, you raise the 9th note in the scale up a half step. So that was just a little fun extra for you. So let's go ahead and tackle the D6 chord specifically. You already formed the foundational chord, which is D, F sharp, and A. So that 6 is just asking you to add the 6th note, which is B. So let's go ahead to the Bm7 chord. Again, you already have the foundational chord. So those are B, D, and F sharp. The 7th note of the scale is what you want to add now, and that would be an A. Just as a kind of aside, the 7th note in the scale is a very unique and contextually influenced note in music. So depending on musical context, we would keep the note as it naturally is in the scale or just automatically flatten it. But your key fingering chart app that you've been using, it should already compensate for that. But it's just a nice little extra thing for you to know. That way, in case you do notice a difference in the 7s, you now know why. But anyways, we can now finally answer the question you had, why is D6 equal to B minor 7? So, I put the chord pitches side by side so you can get a better comparison of them. You'll notice that they are exactly the same notes, just ordered a little differently. So that basically answers your question, why is D6 equal to B minor 7? Again, it's just exactly the same notes for both chords. So then what determines whether the chord will be D6 or B minor 7? What might possibly be your first guess is that it depends on the order of the chord notes. But that's not quite right. Even though we have a neat and ordered system to identify the root, third, fifth, and any other chord pitches, that is really just for analysis purposes. In actual practice, these notes won't always be played with the root being at the bottom or the fifth always being at the top. Chords tell us not the order of which we stack the pitches, but rather, they only tell us what pitches are allowed to be played at that current time and situation. Ultimately, what determines the identity of the chord is the musical context that takes into consideration the entirety of the piece. The direction of the melody, the surrounding chords, all those factor in. It is very much like biblical exegesis, actually, where the proper and most accurate meaning of Philippians 4:13 is determined by seeing the surrounding situation to which it was said rather than just looking at the isolated verse by itself. So Tim, I do hope these, or rather this little presentation kind of answers your question. If you got any more questions, just feel free and shoot me a message and I'll try and tackle it. But anyways, in this next slide, I did include the fingering chart you sent me with the exact notes you're playing. So like I basically took that chart and then I just labeled it with arrows, that way you know where the notes of those chords are lying on the fretboard there. Just in case you might be curious. And in case you're doubly curious, I also included a Baritone ukulele fretboard chart. That way you can see where all of the notes lie on that fretboard, so hopefully that'll help you out. I mean, it's not necessary to know all this now to play music on an uke, but it's always good to know whenever you got the time to study it and just look at it and just feed your curiosity there. Finally, just because you raised the question, you were kind of curious about the different sizes of the ukuleles. Aside from the U bass, here's a pretty good chart that gives you a decent look at how big these ukes can be and how big they are in relation to each other. So hopefully you find some good use for it. But anyways, Tim, you have a good one and I hope this helped. If you need clarification, again, let me know. Bye bye.